Just as the world is being forced to isolate itself indoors, a parade of huge games has arrived to console us. Conspiracy? Probably not, no. If you're in the middle of working from home though, you might be looking mournfully across at Final Fantasy VII. The remake looks stunning, and for all the innate concern about trampling all over people's childhood memories, the anticipation for it could not have been higher. But what if, despite the PS1 being their first and most beloved console, someone had never actually played the original? What if someone had never really played many JRPGs at all, let alone from that era? Would they still, in 2020, consider it one of the greatest games they'd never played? We're about to find out. If you were confused about that weird construction at the top there, that person is me. I loved the PS1 and I still do. I remember it for the cartoonish and colourful games like Crash and Spyro and, Tombi. But I also remember it for the weird titles, the off-kilter stuff like Hogs of War and Future Cop and, Tombi. What I don't particularly remember it for is RPGs. I don't know by what divine miracle I missed out on these games, honestly. At least not up to a point. See, people bought games for me for a while and I bought games for myself after that, but a handful of years after I got my PS1, an uncle of mine upgraded... Why am I doing air quotes? This is audio. He swapped my PS1 for his chipped one. So out went the console smothered in Crash 3 stickers, and in came a new one with a box of definitely very legal games, pretty much all of which were on single discs. And as anyone who's ever played a PS1 JRPG will know, there aren't too many on single discs. Well, ignoring Alundra, Grandia, Breath of Fire 3 and 4, Vandal Hearts, Jade Cocoon and FF Tactics, but hey, for the purposes of this argument, no multi-disc games, and ergo, no main series Final Fantasy. So the following information was all very new to me. You primarily control Cloud, a spiky-haired lout who's left paramilitary group Soldier and joined resistance group Avalanche. There he teams up with hot-headed Barrett, childhood friend Tifa and a crew of assorted misfits to take on Shinra, a megalithic corporation that's literally sucking the life out of the planetary core. From blowing up power plants in Midgard, the centrepiece of their empire, you eventually sprawl out across a vast map that includes a ski resort, a village full of ninjas, and a bit of deep sea diving. As I mentioned up top, the game is a JRPG. JRPGs tend to put you in control of a party of characters, often in a sort of brooding coming-of-age story. They tend to be fantasy-based and borrow heavily from the tropes, archetypes and aesthetics of anime. They also have a bit of a reputation for being grindy. In other words, making you do a lot of busy work to level up your characters before you can proceed with the story. If I had a major doubt going into FF7, it was the prospect of grinding, which is not something I've ever really enjoyed. Now, there's a lot of talk about the best way to play old games, and particularly with something like FF7, which has got ports out the wazoo. Since I love the PS1 anyway, and most people's memories of playing FF7 are on the PS1, that's what I settled on. There is also a school of thought that the PS1 Final Fantasy games didn't port particularly well. While the games apparently play and look fine for the most part, the developer, Square Enix, unfortunately lost the masters for the originals. That meant that when they came to reproduce them at higher resolutions, the original backgrounds didn't exist, they only had the low-res versions from the PS1. There is a mod to correct this in the PC version though, so if you don't have access to a CRT, that may be worth looking into. So, in short, I'd be playing the game on a CRT, there we go, and in the full speed, full screen American version, thank you chipped PlayStation. Now, I was playing with a PS2 controller rather than a PS1 controller, but I'd say the experience was pretty authentic. At the very least, I was seeing the backgrounds in a resolution they were meant to be displayed at and not what they look like in the various modern ports. Like I say, I am a fan of the PS1 era, and I'm more than happy to tolerate the odd chonky polygon if the rest of the game makes up for them. What I honestly wasn't expecting is how much I enjoyed the general look and feel of FF7. Now, this footage is going to do absolutely nothing to communicate this, but FF7 is a surprisingly attractive game at its original resolution. The hand-painted backgrounds are right up there with the Resident Evil titles, which I would consider this gen's high watermark, but since they aren't deliberately underlit, you get to appreciate much more of the detail. They're also frequently used to communicate massive scale, something which you rarely see in Resi's confined environments. It's a really effective way of using that pre-rendering trick, and while it works better with backgrounds that sit very close to the camera, like say the mountains in Wutai, it does generally pay off. There are a handful of areas where the paths and exits aren't immediately obvious, and you will run aimlessly into a few walls, but it didn't wear on me too much. Now, the character models are jaggier than a garage full of E-types, but they do what they can to get around this. Within the first few scenes, it's noticeable how the game uses simple animations to inform you about the characters. Cloud's hair flick, or Jesse rubbing the soot off of his face, or Barrett punching Wedge into the air. For all that they lack physical definition, the characters themselves are well defined. Crucially, you never lose them in the backgrounds either, even as the scale increases. Despite the game's industrial setting, the colours really pop, with a vibrant overworld and neon signs accenting the city slums. If you're coming to it from a modern perspective, it's not going to knock you out, but it does look good for its era. Apart from how the game looks, the next thing I noticed was how it plays. FF7 throws you straight into the action, and while it isn't difficult, it does assume some literacy with its mechanics. It's very possible to die to the first boss if you aren't au fait with using items, for example, and some key elements of the gameplay are only explained in an optional tutorial room. If you're looking for an advanced breakdown of materia, or to learn about the defend and change options, which are hidden in the battle menu by the way, you better not miss the deliberately obscured tutorial basement in Junon about 10 hours in. I appreciate that the game doesn't hold your hand, and I didn't find that this lack of knowledge inhibited me at all, but it is the first example of the game's slightly cluttered mechanics. Central to the combat and RPG aspects of the game are materia, items that slot into your armour or weapons to give you magical powers. These are split into 5 categories. Magic materia, as the name suggests, allow you to cast spells, mostly elemental attacks like fire or earth. Support materia can be paired with other materia like charging up an attack or making an attack hit all of the enemies on screen instead of just one. Command materia unlocks new active abilities such as sensing how much HP an enemy has left or letting you attack twice in one turn. Independent materia unlocks passive abilities such as boosting your stats or counter-attacking when you're hit. And finally, summon materia allows you to summon a menagerie of monsters to deal damage for you. The range of options this gives you is great, as is the fact that you can apply your materia to whichever character you like. While you all have different basic attacks and unique abilities, you can essentially create your own classes by mixing and matching materia. If you feel so inclined, and I definitely did, this means you can stick with the same few characters throughout the game and not really miss out on that much. For someone who finds some skill trees in class systems in Western games a bit rigid, this was honestly a revelation. I love it, please use it in more things. In a less ambitious game, that would be pretty much the only real mechanic that you have to worry about. Not so, says FF7. For a start, your materia all gain XP and level up as you use them, or at least for as long as they're attached to your character. To help this along, there are certain weapons and armour which will double the XP gain for your materia. There are also some which provide 0 XP gain for your materia, usually in a trade-off for higher damage in combat, and all weapons have different numbers of slots, as well as some paired slots, which allow you to combine certain materia together. There's also your character's XP, which affects their stats and which levels up completely independently of your armour and materia. Oh, and equipped materia also affect your character's stats, with magic materia raising your magic power but lowering your physical attributes. Not all materia are made equal either. While some don't need much attention, others need to be carefully managed. There's one kind of materia called the enemy skill materia, which you'll find a few of throughout the game. This materia harvests enemy abilities for your character to use, many of which are both very cool looking and very useful. To get these abilities, you have to have the materia equipped, but you also need to make sure enemies attack that character with that ability. Note that the game doesn't tell you which enemies have abilities you can harvest, and in many cases the enemies are actually programmed not to use those abilities. You have to use another materia called Manipulate to see their moveset and then attack yourself. Summon materia, meanwhile, like magic materia, do different types of damage, things like fire or poison or holy. While the sense materia will tell you what certain enemies are weak to, the game doesn't tell you which kind of damage your own summons do. You literally have to guess from the animation. While your summons do get stronger as you level them up, you also get new summons throughout the game which tend to be significantly stronger than the ones you had before. While the damage types of older ones may be useful if you can remember them, it's often worth just leveling the new ones up instead. Oh, and some summons do piercing magic damage rather than regular damage, which will ignore a target's magic defense and is also something you don't know. There are also status effects, kind of like in Pokemon, things like Sadness and Fury and Frog. Some of these effects are what's known as debuffs, purely debilitating effects that make you slower or stop you from casting spells. Others, however, might be useful. Fury, for instance, reduces your accuracy but makes your limit gauge fill up faster, more on that in a second, while Berserk increases your attack damage but means you can only do basic attacks. These can be cast randomly by enemies, but you can also cast some of them on yourself, allowing you to micromanage certain characters. You can also equip items which nullify some or all of these statuses, or even which inflict them on a character automatically. Now, your limit gauge is a bar that slowly fills up as you take damage in combat, and it is quite important. When it fills up, you get to use what's called a limit break. Limit breaks deal a lot of damage, often to multiple targets, as well as some status effects. There are 4 tiers of limit breaks, each containing 2 attacks, which you can choose from in battle. When you access a new tier of limit breaks, you have to manually select it in the main menu to use it. The 4th tier of limit breaks, meanwhile, can only be unlocked by finding items in the world which teach it to a specific character, some of which are extremely well hidden. On top of this, you also have 2 different rows you can set your characters up in. A melee character will deal less damage from the back row, but will also take less damage, while a ranged character, as far as I know, can be placed anywhere with no penalties. And characters in either of those rows can also choose to defend on their turn, reducing the damage they take even further. Finally, you have your character's XP, which affects their stats and which levels up completely independently of your armour and your materia. Now, some of these are UI issues more than they are fundamental problems with the game. Things like having to scroll through empty menu options to select your skills and summons, or not being able to see what an item does when you use it in a battle, which are also a thing. But as much as I managed to absorb all of this, I couldn't help feeling that the game was being a tad over-ambitious. And I get it, this was a grand statement. The first Final Fantasy game in 3D, but also the first to include CG cutscenes, the first to operate on such a colossal scale. It was era-defining, and the temptation to pour everything into it is obvious. And maybe I'm being a bit too harsh. After all, you can ignore almost all of this if you want to. I literally didn't use defend once in the entire game, and I continually forgot about which rows my characters were in. I had completely forgotten that there was a runaway mechanic until I read my notes back, because there's also a materia that does the same thing for you, and you rarely need it anyway. And I don't have a problem with additional content and endless layers of micromanagement when it feels entirely optional. I do love turn-based strategy games, and they are chock full of that. But they also tend to have a tick box or an option somewhere that does a lot of that stuff for you. In FF7, it sort of doesn't feel optional. You could ignore all of that stuff, just like you could ignore all of the characters' side quests and the hidden details, but it will make the game substantially harder and substantially less fun. This is a long game, and while the rhythms of combat are pretty enjoyable, like I say, I love the variety of attacks and spells you get to use, it will get tedious very quickly if you don't know that you should be, say, pairing all materia with your magic materia in linked slots, or you keep finding that enemies are immune to your attacks. I frequently got bored of random encounters in certain areas, and I knew how to do most of that stuff. But hey, I don't like random encounters as a mechanic in anything, so your mileage may vary. The game's combat was a bit of a mixed bag then, but what about the story? This is an RPG after all. If you're going to be reading text boxes for dozens of hours, it needs to stand up to scrutiny. I'll be honest, I only knew one thing about the story of FF7 going into it, and it involved a character called Eris. Now, it is impossible to have existed on the internet for as long as I have without knowing about Eris, but if you managed thus far, congratulations, I'm not going to spoil anything for you. Suffice it to say that FF7's story has an epic sweep, taking in a huge variety of locations and characters and putting the fate of the planet in your hands. If I thought the combat mechanics were a tad overambitious, boy howdy does the story go some places. Broadly speaking, it's a parable about environmentalism and a treatise on grief. It also reflects on the merits of terrorism for a seemingly just cause, has a surprisingly nuanced approach to mental health for 1997, and at one point has you threaten to castrate a mafia boss. There really is something here for everyone. Now, environmentalism was not exactly new back then, but to see it in a major piece of media, let alone a video game, still feels incredibly novel. This is the same year that the film Princess Mononoke came out, which, if I hadn't known any better, I would have assumed was a major touchstone. There is so much of Mononoke in FF7 and vice versa. The depletion of natural resources for technological prowess, and the particular focus on arcane machines of war, the spirits which embody nature and rise up against man, even the central character who carries a curse that is tied to the fate of the planet. I think Mononoke's bad guys are a lot more nuanced, and there's some obvious mecha anime influences there too, but all of this is highly commendable and it generally works really well. Like the Studio Ghibli films, the Final Fantasy games have also become indelibly tied to one composer. In this case, that man is Nobuo Uematsu, and he's probably the element of the game I was most familiar with going in. I remember using One Winged Angel in a school presentation about game music maybe 15 years ago after literally googling best game music. I was expecting a lot then, and it mostly lived up to that. The hits are here and they still tug at the heartstrings, even if you wish the orchestral era had swung by just a little bit earlier. I did find some of the incidental music to be less impressive, with some repetitive and slightly grating loops in a number of locations, and while the game's main theme is a barnstormer, the prelude to the game is nails on a blackboard stuff. I looked it up and Uematsu apparently wrote it in somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes. Now, I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but if it isn't, it does make a lot of sense. There is a lot of melancholy in the score though, and it definitely lends weight to the game's many dramatic moments. That's something you'll be thankful for when it comes to grappling with the translation. The writing in FF7 is probably its biggest obstacle, and while it isn't the worst I've seen in a game from this era, it isn't the greatest either. There are a handful of lines that are garbled beyond recognition, while a lot of the writing just lacks some subtlety. See Tifa's immortal "You're sure messed up" Cloud after a heartfelt speech about his mental health. But for the most part, it is intelligible and occasionally even poignant. The moments when the intent shines through the translation and the game reaches towards something genuine are rare, but when it does, you do connect to it on an emotional level. The weirdness shines through too. This is a much more adult game than I ever expected it to be. I'd heard that Cloud cross-dresses in the game before, but the manner in which it happens, and the side quests leading up to it, that was mind-blowing to me. And that's just the start of a carnivalesque parade of oddities. The enemy design, for instance, is incredibly varied, ranging from your store-brand dragons and goblins to creations Cronenberg would have trashed for being just a little bit too out there. And while the game's script isn't particularly sharp, some of the insults are pleasingly blunt. There's some fruity language sprinkled throughout the game, a lot of it coming from Barrett and Sid, which again isn't something I associate with games of this era. Cloud labels himself a jack of all trades early on, and in many ways that seems to have been Square's mission statement for the game. The variety of minigames and random mechanics would make Hideo Kojima wince. There's a sudden snowboarding sequence, a submarine chase, a bit where you do CPR on a small child. There's even an entire side portion of the game dedicated to a proto-tower defense title. A lot of these games are dreadful, to be honest, or at least you will be dreadful at them, because they're essentially early David Cage. You get no warning and no opportunity to practice, and if you screw them up, the game continues as normal. But the fact that they're even there is kind of astounding to me, and unlike the combat mechanics, they never felt overwhelming, just unexpected. The prospect of the next mad sideshow was exciting, and it kept me going through some of the game's weaker moments. In many ways, that's the story of FF7 to me. The weaknesses are caverns the size of the northern crater. To get all the items from that tower defense minigame, you actually have to abandon the main story at pivotal moments and travel halfway across the map. And at least that bit's optional. My personal low point was straight after that snowboarding sequence when you're plunged into the Great Glacier. Assuming you picked up the map, you'll know that there are 14 sections here, linked either by several screens of pathways or a snowfield that acts much like the game's overworld. And it's a neat idea. The map is literally a paper map and you have to navigate by recognising landmarks. It's tabletop RPG stuff. But then you realise there are items hidden in some of these areas, but not all of them, and that some items require you to perform actions in another location. And here's the kicker, you collapse every 500 or so steps due to the cold and get teleported back to the starting area. Hell hath no fury like a man who collapses 3 steps away from an item and has to travel back through 15 screens of encounters. There's a bunch of stuff like this, some of it crucial to the plot that you would have no idea about unless you looked it up or someone told you on the playground. And that kind of mythos is great on one level and infuriating on another. But there's nothing worse than a boring game, and FF7 is never boring. I didn't fall madly in love with it, I didn't always enjoy the process of playing it, and I ultimately don't think it holds up all that well. But it is incredibly interesting and so fundamentally different to anything else I've ever played. In that respect, Final Fantasy VII is still a great game, and if the remake gets things right, it could be even better. Thank you so much for watching this video. I am amazed you made it to the end. I first had the idea for a series like this about 8 years ago, so hopefully it won't be another 8 years until the next one, but hit subscribe and we'll find out together.